Roy Baxter had lived on that land for over 50 years, and his family had owned it for nearly a century before that. 150 acres of rolling fields, thick woods, and a stretch of river that cut through the property like a silver vein. It was a farm once, a thriving one, back when his father was alive and when Roy had the strength to work the land the way it was meant to be worked. Now, it was a place of solitude, a retreat from the world that had grown too loud, too fast, and too greedy. He didn't grow much anymore, just enough to keep himself busy some vegetables, a few apple trees that still bore decent fruit, and enough wild game roaming through the property that he never had to worry about an empty dinner plate. It wasn't about the farm anymore, it was about the land itself, the history buried in its soil, the life he had built there with his own hands. But the world had a way of creeping in, even when you'd spent a lifetime keeping it out. It started with a letter. Roy found it in his mailbox one morning, tucked in between a stack of junk advertisements and a utility bill. He almost didn't open it, figuring it was just another pointless notice from some office trying to sell him something he didn't need. But something about the thick, official-looking envelope made him pause. The return address was from a real estate development firm he'd never heard of. That alone was enough to put a bad taste in his mouth. Inside, the letter was cold and to the point. His property had been incorporated into a newly designated residential area, and as a result, it was now subject to new regulations, new fees, and new obligations. A homeowners association had been established, and Roy was now, as of this notice, a member. He would be expected to pay annual dues, adhere to community guidelines, and make necessary adjustments to his property to bring it up to the new standards. The language was sterile, corporate, and infuriating. Roy snorted, crumpled the paper in his calloused fist, and tossed it into the wood-burning stove without a second thought. They had the wrong man. A few days later, the second letter arrived. This one was more aggressive. A fine had been issued for property maintenance violations. His barn was deemed an eyesore, his fencing was non-compliant, and there were unregistered vehicles and equipment on the premises. A total of $10,000 in penalties. The notice gave him 30 days to pay. Roy didn't even bother burning this one. He threw it on the counter, grabbed his truck keys, and drove straight to the town office. He was ready to tell them where they could shove their regulations and fines. The office was small, tucked between a bank and a law firm, one of those places that looked more like a doctor's waiting room than a place where decisions were made that could rip a man's life apart. A receptionist barely looked up from her desk as he walked in, but when he dropped the letter on the counter hard enough to rattle the pen holder, she finally acknowledged him. "I need to speak to someone about this." His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the irritation in his tone. She glanced at the letter, sighed like she'd seen 100 of them that week, and gestured toward the hallway. "Office at the end. Mr. Duke will answer your questions." That name meant nothing to Roy, but he had a feeling he wasn't going to like whoever it belonged to. Vincent Duke was everything Roy expected mid-40s, suit a little too sharp for a man who didn't actually work with his hands, and a smile that was too polished to be real. He didn't offer a handshake, just leaned back in his chair, arms folded, as Roy stepped into the office. Mr. Baxter, Duke said, as if he were greeting an old friend. "I was wondering when you'd come in. Please have a seat." Roy didn't sit. He crossed his arms and stayed planted where he was. "I'm not paying a damn fine for land that belongs to me, and I'm not part of any damn association." Duke sighed, as if Roy were a slow student struggling with a simple lesson. "I understand this might be frustrating, but the matter is already settled. The county approved the expansion plans last year, and all properties within the new boundary lines fall under the association's governance. It's standard procedure. Not for me, it ain't." "Well, that's where we disagree." Duke smiled like a man who had already won. "Your land is now part of an incorporated development. The benefits are numerous: road maintenance, security, property value protection." Roy cut him off with a scoff. "Spare me the sales pitch. I didn't sign anything." "You didn't need to," Duke replied smoothly. "The jurisdiction change was handled at the county level. Everything is perfectly legal." Roy stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. So what happens if I don't pay? Duke's smile widened just a fraction. Then the fines accumulate. If they remain unpaid, a lien is placed on the property. If the debt surpasses a certain threshold, the property can be seized and auctioned to cover the balance. Again, all perfectly legal. Roy didn't move, didn't react, didn't blink. He just stared at Duke like a man studying something rotten. Finally, he said, "You get a lot of men my age in here, don't you? Sitting where I am now, arguing the same thing." Duke just kept smiling. Roy nodded, already knowing the answer. "How many of them fight back?" Duke let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head like Roy was amusing him. "Not many." Roy absorbed that. Then he turned, walked out without another word, and slammed the door behind him. He drove home in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The rage was there, sitting low in his chest, but he didn't let it spill over. Anger wouldn't win this, but something else would. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he already had a plan. He wasn't going to yell, wasn't going to argue. He was going to make sure every single person involved in this mess regretted ever thinking they could take something from him. They wanted a fight. They just found the wrong man to pick it with. The next letter arrived a week later, but this time it wasn't just a fine. It was a warning. The phrasing was legalistic, deliberately convoluted, but the meaning was clear. The fines had increased due to non-compliance, and if Roy failed to acknowledge his obligations, further action would be taken, including the placement of a lien on his property. There was an attachment, a list of supposed violations. The barn was still standing. His fences didn't meet community aesthetic standards. There was an abandoned vehicle, his old, rusted-out tractor that hadn't moved in 20 years, causing an unsightly visual disturbance. And most infuriatingly of all, his land was deemed underutilized, meaning it wasn't being used in a way that benefited the community. Roy read that last line twice, his fingers tightening around the paper. Underutilized. They were acting like his land belonged to them, like it was some vacant lot they had the right to repurpose for something better. He felt his stomach twist, not with fear, but with something darker, something colder. At first, he considered ignoring it again, but he knew better. These people weren't going away. The last time he was in town, he'd seen the way Duke had looked at him like a man already counting his winnings, certain that Roy would either fold or break. He had seen that look before, from salesmen, from land speculators, from every two-bit snake who thought a handshake was the same as ownership. 2 days later, a black SUV pulled up his driveway just after noon. Roy had been out back, checking the fence line, and by the time he made it to the porch, 2 men in neatly pressed polo shirts were already standing by his truck, looking around like they owned the place. He didn't ask who they were. He already knew. One of them, a clean-shaven man with a clipboard, smiled like they were old friends. "Afternoon, sir. You Roy Baxter?" Roy didn't answer. He leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, waiting. The man seemed unbothered by the silence. He tapped the clipboard. "We're here on behalf of the committee overseeing the new residential area. We just need to do a quick compliance check." The other man, broader in the shoulders and less interested in smiling, stepped past him, already making his way toward the barn. Roy didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He just said, "Step 1 more foot and I'll put you in the dirt." The man froze, turned slightly, eyes flicking to his partner. The smiling one gave a half laugh. Raising his hands like this was all a misunderstanding. "Sir, there's no need to be hostile. We're just here to—" "Don't care," Roy interrupted. "You're trespassing. Get off my land." The broad-shouldered one took a step back toward the SUV, but Clipboard held his ground, still trying to play it like he was the reasonable one. "Mr. Baxter, if you refuse to comply, this is only going to escalate. We're trying to work with you here. You're part of the community now, and there are rules that need to be followed." Roy exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I'm not part of a damn thing." Clipboard kept his hands up in that placating way, still smiling but with something harder behind his eyes now. "I get it. You've been here a long time, you don't like change. But this isn't just about you. This land is valuable, and there are plans in place that can benefit everyone. We can make this easy, Mr. Baxter. All we need is cooperation. That was when Roy saw it. A freshly printed map, partially sticking out from the clipboard. His property was on it, but it wasn't labeled the way it should have been. Instead of his name, there was a corporate designation. And instead of an open farm, there were neat little grids, the kind used for residential planning. They had already divided it up. They had already planned to take it. Roy let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then he pushed off the railing, took 2 slow steps forward. You come back here again, you won't be leaving in that SUV. Clipboard's smile faltered. He glanced at his partner, then back at Roy, then finally exhaled, shaking his head as if Roy had disappointed him. All right, Mr. Baxter, you do what you have to do. They left without another word, but Roy knew this wasn't over. That night, he barely slept. He kept thinking about that map, about the way Duke had smirked in his office, about the wording of the letters. This wasn't just about collecting fines or enforcing community standards. This was a full-scale land grab, and he was standing in the way. At dawn, he drove back into town. Not to the committee office, not to any government building, but to an old metal shop on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled like oil and burnt metal. Inside, he found the man he was looking for, Lawrence Cole, an attorney whose office wasn't in some glass building downtown, but in a shop that doubled as his personal workshop. Lawrence had grease on his hands and a welding mask pushed back on his head when Roy walked in. The lawyer glanced up, then wiped his hands on a rag. You look mad. I need you to look at something. Roy dropped the letters on the workbench. Lawrence flipped through them, expression darkening with every page. By the time he reached the last one, he was shaking his head. Jesus, they're not even being subtle about it. So what do we do? Roy asked. Lawrence exhaled, rubbing his chin. First, we check the property records. If they've already started transferring ownership, then this is bigger than just some fines. This is fraud, and if they have. Lawrence looked up, eyes sharp. Then we take the gloves off. Roy nodded, already knowing that this was the only way it was going to play out. That evening he drove home, knowing full well that the fight had just begun. He wasn't scared, he wasn't nervous, he was just angry. And anger, when aimed in the right direction, could do a hell of a lot of damage. The morning after Roy met with Lawrence, something felt off. It wasn't just the uneasy weight in his chest, or the quiet hum of tension that had settled over him ever since those men showed up at his property. It was something else, something tangible. A shift in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. He stepped outside onto his porch, sipping his black coffee, eyes scanning the long stretch of gravel road leading up to his house. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, but it wasn't strong enough to mask the stench of intrusion. Roy knew his land. He knew every tree, every dip in the terrain, every unnatural break in the patterns of nature. And that's why, within seconds of stepping outside, he noticed it. The lock on his tool shed was broken. Not forced open, but cut clean through. A deliberate act. He moved slowly, his boots crunching against the dirt as he approached. The door hung slightly ajar, the darkness inside swallowing the morning light. He pushed it open with the back of his hand and let his eyes adjust. At first, nothing seemed disturbed. His old chainsaw was still where he'd left it. His rusted toolboxes lined the workbench, and his spare gas cans sat untouched in the corner. But then he saw it, his land records. They were missing. He had kept them in an old metal filing cabinet in the corner of the shed, tucked between his father's military papers and a stack of faded receipts from decades ago. The drawer was wide open, empty except for a few scattered envelopes. Whoever had been here hadn't taken anything else. They hadn't even bothered with his guns, which sat on a rack just above the workbench. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. Roy clenched his jaw, exhaling slowly through his nose. He wasn't a fool. He knew what was happening. First, the fines. Then, the men with their fake smiles and polished shoes. And now this. They weren't just trying to push him out, they were actively erasing his ability to fight back. But they had underestimated him. Instead of reacting immediately, Instead of storming into town and demanding answers, Roy did what any man in his position should do. He called Lawrence. The lawyer picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "This better be good." "They broke into my shed," Roy said, his tone flat, controlled. Silence on the other end. Then, a slow exhale. "What'd they take?" "My land records." Lawrence cursed under his breath. "All right, first thing we do, go to the county clerk's office and pull a new copy. If they've already altered anything, we'll know. And if they have, then it's war." Roy hung up and took his time. He finished his coffee, fed his dog, and checked the perimeter of his land before heading into town. If they were watching him, and he knew damn well he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. By the time he reached the county clerk's office, Lawrence was already there, leaning against the hood of his truck with a cigarette between his fingers. His suit jacket was draped over the passenger seat, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked as tired as Roy felt. "You ready for this?" Lawrence asked, tossing the cigarette to the ground and grinding it beneath his boot. Roy didn't answer. He just walked inside. The clerk, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, barely glanced up as they approached. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Lawrence stepped forward, slipping on his lawyer's mask like a second skin. "We need to pull the most recent deed records for Roy Baxter's property." The woman typed something into her computer, then frowned. "That's funny," she murmured, her brows knitting together. Lawrence leaned in. "Funny how?" She turned the screen toward them. "The records were updated 2 days ago. But there's a problem. The original documents are missing from our system." Roy felt his stomach tighten. Lawrence's face darkened. "Missing?" The clerk nodded. "Normally we keep all historical records intact, even when new deeds are processed. But in this case, it looks like someone manually removed the previous files. That's not standard practice." Roy inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the situation settle into his bones. They had wiped him from the system. Lawrence straightened, his tone turning razor sharp. "Who approved the update?" The clerk hesitated, glancing around as if she wasn't sure she should be telling them. Then, finally, she exhaled and leaned in slightly. "Vincent Duke." Roy had expected it, but hearing the name still sent a pulse of heat through his veins. Lawrence took a step back, rubbing his jaw. "All right, we'll handle this through the legal channels. In the meantime, can you print whatever records are available, even if they're incomplete?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I can do that." They left the office with a thin stack of papers, barely enough to prove Roy even existed on that land. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Lawrence turned to him, his voice low. "They're trying to get you out before you can stop them. If they wipe your records completely, they can claim the land was never yours to begin with." Roy stared out at the quiet streets of town, his mind already working. "Then we don't let them." Lawrence exhaled sharply. "I need to file an emergency injunction. That'll put a hold on any further changes to the property records, but it won't last forever." Roy nodded. "Do it." He drove home in silence, his grip tight on the wheel. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A moving truck. It was parked on the side of the road, just beyond his property line. A man in a reflective vest stood beside it, clipboard in hand, talking to another man dressed in a suit. Roy didn't recognize them, but he didn't have to. They were already preparing to take what was his. Roy parked the truck, got out slowly, and walked toward them. Neither man noticed him at first. The suited one was gesturing toward the property, pointing at different areas, while the worker scribbled notes on the clipboard. When Roy was 10 feet away, he finally spoke. "You boys lost." The suited man turned, startled, but quickly composed himself. "Ah, Mr. Baxter, I was just discussing the preliminary logistics with our contractor here." Roy's jaw clenched. "Logistics for what?" The man smiled. "The upcoming development, of course." Roy took another step forward, his eyes dark. "There ain't going to be a development." The man didn't flinch. He just smiled wider. "That's not up to you anymore." Roy exhaled slowly. Then, without another word, he reached forward, grabbed the clipboard, and ripped it in half with one sharp motion. The worker flinched. The suited man's smile faltered. "You tell your boss," Roy said, voice like gravel, "that if he wants my land, he better bring more than a piece of paper." The man stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once, signaling to the worker. Without another word, they climbed into the truck and drove off. Roy watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides. They thought this was over. They thought he would fold. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Roy didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch, a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, watching the dark stretch of road in front of his land. The wind whistled through the trees, the occasional rustling of branches the only sound breaking the heavy silence. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was something else entirely focused, deliberate, like a man who had already made peace with what needed to be done. By the time the first light of dawn bled through the horizon, he knew what he had to do. He grabbed his keys, got into his truck, and headed back to town. This time he wasn't going to waste words. Lawrence was already at his office when Roy walked in, a cup of gas station coffee in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. He looked up, eyebrows raised, as Roy shut the door behind him and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "They're moving faster than we thought," Lawrence said, setting the coffee down. "I filed the injunction, but Duke must have pulled some strings because it hasn't slowed them down." Roy nodded once. "What's the next move?" Lawrence sighed, rubbing his temple. "We need leverage. Right now they've got the county, they've got the paperwork, and they've got money. If we can prove fraud, we have a shot at getting this whole thing thrown out." And Lawrence hesitated. And fraud is hard to prove when the people committing it are the same ones in charge of keeping the records. Roy let that sink in. He'd spent his life dealing with problems head-on, but this wasn't something that could be solved with brute force. If they wanted to beat Duke at his own game, they needed to play smarter. Lawrence tapped the stack of papers on his desk. "I pulled every available record on your property. What's left of them, anyway? The deed transfer looks clean. But I don't buy it. I talked to a guy in the clerk's office last night. Off the record, he says the original records weren't just erased, they were replaced. Someone created a whole new chain of ownership that makes it look like your land was sold over a decade ago." Roy frowned. "That's impossible." "Yeah, but it's what's on paper now." Roy exhaled slowly, staring out the window. He had expected dirty tactics, but this was something else. They weren't just pushing him off his land, they were rewriting history, erasing his very existence from it. Lawrence kept going. "There's a name on the original sale records, some shell company. But here's where it gets interesting: the corporation that supposedly bought your land. It dissolved 2 years ago, which means someone forged that document recently and backdated it." Roy's jaw tightened. "Then we find out who." Lawrence nodded. "I've got a contact at the state registrar's office. If we can trace the money, we can prove the sale was fabricated." Roy pushed off the wall. "How long?" Lawrence hesitated. "A week, maybe more." Roy shook his head. "We don't have a week." Lawrence looked at him carefully. "Then we make them come to us." Roy didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. That afternoon he drove back to the farm. He parked the truck by the barn, stepped out and stood there for a long time, just looking at the land. He thought about his father, about the hours they'd spent fixing fences, planting crops, watching storms roll in from the hills. He thought about the nights he'd spent under the stars, the mornings when the mist hung low over the fields, the sound of crickets humming through the summer heat. And then he thought about Duke. Roy walked to the edge of his property, where the old fence line met the gravel road. He pulled a crowbar from the back of his truck and, with a few solid swings, tore down the first section of fence. The wood splintered, falling to the ground in a heap of dust and rusted nails. Then he took out a can of red spray paint and, in bold letters across the side of his barn, wrote 3 words: "Stay off my land." By nightfall, he knew they'd see it. He was right. The next morning, A convoy of black SUVs rolled up the road, stopping just short of his driveway. Roy was already on the porch, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, watching as Duke stepped out of the lead vehicle. The man adjusted his cufflinks, smoothed down his tie, then made his way toward the house with that same smug expression he always wore. Roy didn't stand up. He just waited. Duke stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, hands in his pockets, making quite the statement, Mr. Baxter. Roy took a sip of coffee. Figured I'd clear up any confusion. Duke smirked. You know, most men in your position would take the money and walk away. You're not going to win this. Roy set his cup down on the railing. That a threat? Duke chuckled. Just a fact. The paperwork is done. Your land is already accounted for. We're just giving you a chance to make this easier on yourself. Roy leaned forward slightly, eyes locking onto Duke's. Let me tell you something about this land. It's not just dirt. It's not just acres on a map. My father built this house with his own hands. My grandfather worked these fields until his back gave out. I was born here. I'll die here. And the only way you're getting this land is if you bury me in it. Duke's smile faltered just for a second. Then he sighed, shaking his head like Roy was a lost cause. You're making a mistake. Roy picked up his coffee cup again. So are you. Duke didn't respond. He just turned, motioned to his men, and walked back to his SUV. Within minutes, the convoy was gone. Roy knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. That night, he stayed up, listening to the sounds of the land, waiting for the next move. And when the headlights came creeping up the road just past midnight, he was already waiting, shotgun resting across his lap. They thought they could scare him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Roy was already awake when the first set of headlights cut through the darkness, creeping up the long gravel road leading to his house. He had been sitting in the old wooden chair on his porch for the last 3 hours, watching the tree line, listening to the sounds of the night. He knew this was coming. They weren't going to let what happened earlier stand. Duke wasn't the kind of man to back off after a warning. Men like him didn't see warnings, they saw challenges, and Roy had just thrown one straight in his face. He set his coffee cup down on the armrest and stood, slow and deliberate, stretching out his stiff shoulders before stepping inside. The shotgun was already loaded, resting against the door frame, just within reach. He didn't grab it. Not yet. Instead, he walked to the kitchen, turned on the sink, and splashed cold water on his face. The trick to moments like this was staying calm. That's what separated men who walked away from fights and men who got carried out. By the time he stepped back outside, the vehicle had stopped about 20 yards from the house. The engine cut off, leaving nothing but the sound of crickets and the low whisper of the wind pushing through the trees. The driver's side door opened first. A man stepped out, dressed in dark slacks and a button-down, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He wasn't wearing a jacket, which meant he wasn't carrying. At least not anything obvious. 2 more men stepped out of the passenger side in the back, both built like they spent more time in a gym than an office. They didn't say anything at first, just stood there, waiting. Roy exhaled slowly, stepping off the porch, boots crunching against the dirt. He stopped about 10 feet from them, arms relaxed at his sides. Long way to come just to stare at me. The man in the button-down smiled, but it wasn't friendly. We both know why we're here, Mr. Baxter. Roy didn't answer. He just tilted his head slightly, waiting. The man sighed, taking a step forward, hands clasped in front of him like he was about to have a polite business conversation. Look, I'll be honest with you. You're becoming a problem. A problem my employer doesn't want to have. Roy let the silence stretch, forcing the man to keep talking. You're making this difficult, and I don't understand why. The man continued. You have an opportunity here. A good one. Most people in your position would take the money and move on. Roy snorted. Most people aren't me. The man smirked, like that was exactly the answer he expected. No, they're not. Which is why I'm here. We're done with the paperwork, the court orders, the fines. That was just business. But you wanted to make this personal. So now here we are. Roy's jaw tightened. You came all this way to tell me what I already know. The smirk dropped. I came all this way to tell you this is your last chance to walk away on your own terms. Roy didn't move, didn't blink. And if I don't? The man sighed, shaking his head like he was disappointed. Then we stop asking. Roy stared at him for a long moment. He could hear the shift in the two men behind him, the slight repositioning of their feet, the way they squared their shoulders. That was the thing about men who did dirty work for other people, they always had tells. And Roy had been reading men like them his whole life. He nodded once. All right, the man raised an eyebrow. All right, what? All right, we're done talking. The man's lips parted slightly, confused, but before he could react, Roy took a single step back, just enough to put himself within reach of the shotgun leaning against the porch railing. He didn't shoulder it, didn't aim, just let the sound of the pump action loading a shell into the chamber do all the talking for him. The two men behind the leader tensed. The man in the button-down exhaled through his nose. That's not necessary. Roy rested the shotgun against his shoulder. Neither was showing up here in the middle of the night. The man's jaw tightened. For a second, Roy thought he might actually be stupid enough to push it. But then he sighed again, running a hand through his hair, and turned back toward the SUV. Let's go. The two muscleheads hesitated for a moment before following. Roy watched them climb into the vehicle. Watched the brake lights glow red as the engine roared to life. Watched them roll back down the driveway and disappear into the night. He didn't relax. Didn't let his shoulders drop, because this wasn't over. It was just getting started. By the next morning, the retaliation had already begun. Roy woke up to the sound of engines, deep, guttural, mechanical. He stepped onto his porch and saw a line of construction vehicles parked just outside his property line. Trucks, bulldozers, excavators. And standing in front of them, clipboard in hand, was Vincent Duke. Roy's hands curled into fists at his sides. Duke turned as if he felt the weight of Roy's stare. He smiled, waved, then pointed toward the trees lining the edge of Roy's land. The meaning was clear. They weren't coming for the house. They were coming for everything around it. Roy forced himself to stay calm. He walked down the steps across the yard, stopping just a few feet from where Duke stood. You've got no right to be here. Duke smiled wider. I've got every right, Roy. County approval. Signed permits. All perfectly legal. Roy's eyes flicked to the workers behind him. Most of them weren't paying attention. They didn't care about the politics. They were just here to do a job. Roy took a deep breath. You put one machine on my land and I'll bury it where it stands. Duke's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. I'd reconsider that, Roy. You're not a young man, and accidents happen all the time on job sites like this. Roy exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he turned and walked back toward his house. He didn't look back, didn't say another word. He had work to do. By the time the first machine tried to cross onto his land, he was already waiting. He had spent years reinforcing the outer fence, replacing rotted wood with reinforced steel, driving stakes so deep into the ground they'd take hours to remove. He knew this land better than anyone. He knew where the soft ground would swallow the weight of heavy machinery, where tree roots ran thick enough to snap treads, where a man could disappear if he wasn't careful. The first truck made it 5 feet in before the tires sank. The second lost traction when the dirt shifted unexpectedly beneath it. By the time the third machine stalled out completely, the foreman was already cursing. Roy sat on his porch, shotgun resting across his lap, and watched as Duke's carefully planned operation fell apart in real time. Duke stood by his SUV, fists clenched, jaw tight. Roy lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast. Duke turned and walked away without another word. But Roy knew this wasn't over. It never was. Roy didn't bother locking the door that night. It wouldn't have made a difference anyway. The men he was dealing with weren't the kind that backed off just because someone told them to. They weren't the kind to play fair, and they damn sure weren't the kind to walk away after being embarrassed. He had humiliated them, not once but twice now. First, by tearing down their fence and painting his message for the whole town to see. Then, by turning their expensive equipment into useless hunks of metal buried up to the axles in mud and soft earth. That was the kind of thing men like Duke didn't forget. So Roy sat in his chair on the porch, shotgun resting across his lap, waiting for what he already knew was coming. He wasn't afraid. He had spent too many years on this land to be afraid of men like them. He knew the hills, the trees, the back roads. If they came for him in the dark, they'd be stepping into his world, not the other way around. And when the first pair of headlights appeared in the distance, he simply took a slow sip of his coffee and watched them approach. This time there were no pretenses. No slick smiles, no legal documents, no fake negotiations. The black SUVs rolled up the driveway, their engines rumbling like distant thunder, and stopped just short of the house. 4 doors opened. 4 men stepped out. Not Duke. These weren't lawyers or committee members. These were the other kind. The kind that didn't leave paper trails. Roy exhaled through his nose, shifting slightly in his chair, eyes steady as he watched them spread out in a loose formation. 1 by the front of the SUV, 2 moving toward the side, flanking him. 1 hanging back by the driver's side door. They weren't being subtle about it. Roy let the silence stretch. Then he said, "If you boys are lost, I can point you back toward town." No one answered. The one closest to the SUV, the leader, if Roy had to guess, took a slow step forward, hands loose at his sides. His jacket was unbuttoned. Easy access. "You know why we're here, Mr. Baxter," the man said, voice calm, smooth. "You've been given plenty of chances to do this the easy way." Roy tilted his head slightly. "And let me guess, you're here to show me what the hard way looks like." The man didn't smile, didn't deny it either. Roy nodded, tapping his fingers against the stock of his shotgun. "You see, that's your mistake. You're treating this like a negotiation, like I'm the kind of man who's going to change his mind because someone put on their serious voice." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't respond to threats. Never have. Never will." The man exhaled through his nose, glancing at the others. Then, just for a second, he made a mistake. He shifted his weight slightly to the side, the kind of movement a man makes when he's about to give a signal. Roy didn't wait for it. The shotgun was up and aimed before the man could even get a word out. He didn't fire. Not yet. He just let the weight of the moment settle, let them all feel the cold realization that this was not going to go the way they thought it would. "Now," Roy said, voice low, steady, "I don't much like killing, but I'm damn sure good at it when I have to be. So unless one of you wants to find out just how good, I suggest you turn your asses around and crawl back to whatever hole Duke sent you from." For the first time there was hesitation. The man in the jacket stared at him, eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he took a step back. Then another. The others followed. They climbed into the SUV. The engine roared to life. The tires spun against the gravel, kicking up dust as they reversed down the driveway and disappeared into the night. Roy didn't move for a long time, didn't lower the shotgun. He just listened to the silence, to the way the crickets had gone quiet, to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. And then, finally, he stood. He knew what had just happened. That wasn't a retreat. That was a delay. A moment of calculation. They would be back. And next time, they wouldn't be knocking. By morning, Roy had already made up his mind. This wasn't about playing defense anymore. Wasn't about waiting for them to make their move. If he wanted to end this, he had to take the fight to them. So he got in his truck and drove straight into town. Lawrence was already waiting at his office, a fresh stack of papers spread across his desk. His eyes flicked up as Roy walked in, taking in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "They came last night," Roy said simply. Lawrence didn't even look surprised. "I figured they would." Roy exhaled through his nose, dragging a hand down his face. "I'm done playing this game. What do we have?" Lawrence leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "It's not great. The injunction slowed them down, but it won't hold forever. And Duke's already greased enough wheels to keep law enforcement out of this." Roy clenched his fists. "Then we hit them where it hurts." Lawrence raised an eyebrow. "And where's that?" Roy pulled out his own stack of papers and dropped them on the desk. "Right here." Lawrence frowned, picking them up. His eyes scanned the pages. Then he stilled. "You son of a bitch," he murmured. Roy crossed his arms. "They tried to bury my records. But they forgot something. My father was a meticulous bastard. He kept copies of everything. And so did I." Lawrence looked up, grinning. "These are the original property deeds." Roy nodded. "And not just mine. I made a few calls this morning. Turns out I'm not the only one Duke's been pulling this scam on." Lawrence let out a slow breath, eyes gleaming with something sharp. "You're saying we take this federal?" Roy's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm saying we burn the whole damn thing down." It took less than 24 hours for the first cracks to show. The lawsuit was filed that afternoon. By the next morning, state investigators were already looking into Duke's financials, and by the time the news broke that multiple landowners had come forward with similar claims, the house of cards had already started to collapse. Roy stood on his porch, watching the sunrise, a cup of coffee warming his hands. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace. And then his phone rang. Lawrence's voice was tight. "Duke's gone." Roy frowned. "Gone. Skipped town. Took everything he could and vanished. No one's seen him since last night." Roy exhaled slowly, letting that sink in. He had expected a fight, had been ready for it. But this was something else. Cowards always ran when the fire got too close. Roy took a slow sip of his coffee, staring out over his land. His land. They had tried to take it from him. They had failed. And now they were the ones running. The morning after Duke vanished, the town felt different. The air was lighter. The tension that had hung over everything for weeks now seemed to dissipate, replaced by something Roy hadn't felt in a long time: quiet. Not the kind of quiet that came before a storm, but the kind that settled in after one had passed, when the damage was done and all that was left was to pick up the pieces. Roy sat on his porch, a fresh cup of coffee in his hands, staring out at his land. It still looked the same trees, same rolling hills, same dirt road leading to the house, but he knew it wasn't. Not really. It had been fought for, nearly lost, and now reclaimed. And in the process, something fundamental had shifted. The phone rang, breaking the silence. He let it ring twice before picking up. "Morning," Lawrence said on the other end. Roy grunted. Lawrence chuckled. "Still not much for conversation, huh?" Roy took a sip of his coffee, waiting. "Thought you'd want to know," Lawrence continued. "The state attorney general's office officially opened an investigation into Duke's development company. Turns out he wasn't just pulling this scam here, he's been doing it across 3 counties. Bribing officials, forging deeds, running up fake liens to squeeze people out of their land." He exhaled sharply. "They've already issued a warrant." Roy leaned back in his chair. "He's gone, for now," Lawrence admitted. "But he won't stay gone. Guys like him never do. He's got too many enemies, too many loose ends. Someone will find him, and when they do, he'll wish he'd stayed missing." Roy didn't respond to that. It didn't matter. Duke was out of the picture. The fight was over. "So what now?" Lawrence asked. Roy stared out at his land. "I go back to living." Lawrence let out a short laugh. "Simple as that." Roy shrugged. "Always was." There was a pause. Then Lawrence sighed. "You know, you could sue. Get some real money out of this. You've got the leverage now. Could make them pay for what they put you through." Roy considered that. He wasn't a rich man, never had been, but he had never cared about money either. His land was his wealth, his freedom. That's what they had tried to take, and that's what he had fought for. "Not interested," he finally said. Lawrence made a noise of amusement. "Didn't think so." "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me." Roy hung up, setting the phone down on the porch railing. For the first time in weeks, he let himself breathe. The aftermath of a battle was never as clean as people liked to believe. There was no perfect ending, no neat resolution where everything just went back to normal. Some things did. His land was still his house still stood, and the air still smelled like pine and dirt when the wind shifted just right. But other things had changed. People in town looked at him differently now. Some with respect, some with caution. The ones who had been too afraid to stand up for themselves now nodded when they passed him on the street. The ones who had stayed quiet while Duke and his people ran unchecked avoided his eyes. Roy didn't care either way. He had never lived his life for anyone else's approval, and he wasn't about to start now. But there was one thing that stuck with him. One afternoon, about a week after everything had settled, he drove into town to pick up some supplies. As he was walking back to his truck, he spotted a man sitting on a bench outside the diner. Mid-50s, rough around the edges, the kind of guy who had spent his life working with his hands. There was something familiar about him, something Roy couldn't quite place until the man looked up and nodded in his direction. Roy stopped. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man said, his voice gravelly. Roy studied him for a moment. "Should I?" The man smirked. "Used to work for Duke. Not for long, but long enough Roy's posture didn't change, but something in his gut tensed. "That's supposed to mean something to me," the man shook his head. "Just figured you'd want to know Duke was scared of you." Roy didn't react, but the man kept talking. "He thought you were going to fold. Thought you'd take the money and walk. But when you didn't, that's when he knew he was in trouble. He wasn't afraid of the law, wasn't afraid of fines or lawsuits. But he was afraid of a man who wasn't for sale." Roy let that sit for a moment before speaking. "That why you quit?" the man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Let's just say I learned the hard way that working for men like Duke only ends one of two ways: prison or a bullet. I didn't want either." Roy nodded once, then turned and climbed into his truck. As he pulled away, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The seasons changed. The leaves turned red, then brown, then fell away. The first frost coated the ground in brittle white, and the mornings grew cold enough that Roy had to start the fire in the wood stove before bed if he wanted the house warm when he woke up. The world kept moving, kept shifting, but for the first time in a long time he felt still. Not stuck, not waiting for the next fight, just present. One evening he sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The air was sharp with the promise of winter, but he didn't mind. He had seen worse, survived worse. His land was his again, not because of a piece of paper, not because of a judge's ruling or a legal technicality, but because he had refused to let it be taken, because he had stood his ground. And in the end, that was all that had ever mattered.